So I would like to welcome you all for AWS API Gateway with Terraform. I also want to thank you, PixelScam, for being crazy enough to accept my talk. But to kick things off, I would like you, or have a little bit of a quiz for you. I would like you to tell me what does those three words have in common. So, anyone? No? You already knew it. But yeah, these are all the three buzzwords that every talk needs to have right now to be considered on the tech world. So now that we took these things out of the way, this not so handsome guy is me. My name is Ricardo Brazão. I'm a software developer focused on the backend for the Onfido, namely on the documents team. Those are my handles, my Slack handle as well. If you need anything after this presentation, don't hesitate to drop a message. But what are we going to talk about here? So we will start a bit saying, describing what's AWS API Gateway. What is this? Some use cases that you can apply to it. After this, a little bit of what is Terraform, and again, a bit of the use cases for it. And then what we are here for. So creating an AWS API Gateway with Terraform. So a bit of sidetrack, a little bit of story time. I'm, as you've seen, a backend developer, but my DevOps experience is really close to none. And when I say close to none, it's like I can only have like 3 seconds conversation with the DevOps before I start just nodding and hoping no one asks me any questions. But there was a challenge at Onfido. We have a monolith, and we want to start to take things out of the monolith. And one of the things that we want to explore is like, we already have things on Amazon, so why not continue to work things out on Amazon if they have some resources? So let's explore a bit what AWS has to offer. Another thing that I hate is pushing buttons. Like, if I can do anything on code, I will do it on code. It's way easier, at least for me, and it's a way to continuously practice. And the other thing is, like, I don't know if anyone's seen the dashboard for anything on AWS. It's not user-friendly at all. So when they said to me, like, OK, let's do something on AWS, I will start looking at AWS dashboard. No, this is not for me. And then some light shed on our VP of engineering said, no, our DevOps team will move everything to Terraform. And that was a God-given send, because everything on Terraform is code. So let's start a bit. What is AWS API Gateway? So AWS API Gateway, it's, as everything on Amazon Web Services, a fully managed service. We don't need to worry about almost anything. But what is this? This could be described as a front door to your backend, the ones that are hosted on Amazon. It will accept API and WebSocket requests, REST and WebSockets API. It has one of those. And with it, you can access anything that you have on the backend. So a picture shamelessly copied from AWS is like this, where you can see where AWS API Gateway stands. So it will stand between the outside world and everything inside AWS. So what could be the use cases for it? So if we are taking things out of our monolith, there's some stuff that you probably just designed the first time that you develop it, namely some kind of authentication. AWS API Gateway could take care of it. So you move the authentication to AWS API Gateway, and you remove that concern for your monolith. Another thing that you can put in is some rate limiting. So if a client can only do 200 requests, you can put the rate limiting on the AWS API Gateway, and as soon as he does the 201, he gets blocked. Another thing that happens, or normally happens when you try to remove stuff out of a monolith, it's that a part of your monolith will start to look like a routing system. So the request comes in, the monolith does nothing, and is just routing the request to another service. So why do we need the monolith in the middle? Why not just every time that you hit the front door, go directly to the door that you want? So even on my learning on this, it's where I started to see serverless. So as you can see, you can start doing AWS API Gateway, and then the API Gateway will start routing to anything that you want. Again, the same picture, but on this case, a more focused part on the backend part. On the other side, we will have Terraform. What is Terraform? Terraform is simply infrastructure as code. So, and with code, it's a much better way for you to have someone reviewing what you're doing. Because if you're doing anything on a dashboard, you yourself are reviewing, pressing buttons and selecting dropdowns, checkboxes, whatever, to mount anything. But in here is code. So with code comes every wonder of code. So you can open pull requests, you can have reviewers, you can have versioning, you have hosting, just like a normal code base. But Terraform also has something, or the way it's developed, it's on the two-step. So once you develop anything on Terraform, it's approved, and you can continue with it. It has a two-step. So you plan, and then you apply. The plan step is just simply a linter. So it's just saying, yeah, this is all well written. There's no variables that you aren't using. There's nothing unlinked. So it's a fact checker. And then you have to apply it. Applying is the ultimate step to bring anything or everything to the outside world. So plan is for you to do locally normally. And then when you apply, you do plan and apply. Next, you have the use cases for Terraform. So anything that you can do on a dashboard, normally you can do on Terraform. They have multiple providers in this case. Terraform is developed by HashiCorp, and they have multiple providers that themselves maintain and test. One of those is, of course, AWS. That's why we're here for. But it also has GitHub and Bitbucket, where you can simply create repos instead of going on the dashboards and picking the buttons. You can also do on Docker, where you can create containers, images. You have Kubernetes, where you can put some, you can create some deployments, pods, anything that you can do on a dashboard, you will do on Terraform. You have RabbitMQ as well. They also do not provide or do not maintain some providers. They are community-driven providers. Those, they just say, yeah, this is a community that was doing it, so I'm not responsible for it. And one of those is Elasticsearch. So let's do some terraforming time, where we will use Terraform to create the AWS Gateway. This will be just a simple example. We will just do a pass-through proxy to our backend. So anything that comes or supposedly is supposed to come to our backend will now pass through the AWS proxy and then go to our backend. I can see you thinking, but why do I need this? You're doing nothing. Well, this is just the first step to a greater good. So you first start proxying everything to the backend. I don't know, wait. You start proxying everything to the backend, and then you fine-grain it to go, for instance, on every action, on every endpoint. And then you put some authentication, some rate limiting, logging. So this is just the first step to greatness. How does the overall picture look like? So Terraform, we will have the provider, where we will configure what provider do we want. Also, we will have, then after we choose the provider, we will have the API, which is already specific to our provider. And then inside the API, we'll do a resource, and then both the method and the integration. A bit on the resource method integration. This is more like a visual cue that I developed to wrap my head around what is the resource, the method, and the integration. I will post this picture will appear multiple times, just for you to be refreshed or on where we are at on the workflow. So, first things first, selecting the provider. Terraform uses, it's a simple block system. So this is the only provider block that we will have. From here on out, it will just be resources blocks. But on the provider block, as stated on the documentation, you have the provider, and in our case, we have AWS. And on every block, there are some mandatory attributes and some optional attributes. In the case of AWS, the mandatory attributes will be our keys to access AWS, and our region, so where do you want to deploy it. So these ones here are variables that Terraform can read. And from where it can read? It can read from environment variables, where you can pass it by environment variables. They could be variables inside the Terraform script that you hard-coded, or you can use, in this case from the secret keys, you can use a shared credentials file or the EC2 role. Terraform does not advise you to do like this. This is just a bit for the example, because when Terraform deconstructs all the blocks, he will store everything on blank. So your keys will be the simple strings will be hard-coded there. So your key or your secrets will be available. The region, as I said, is the region where you will deploy everything. If you have multiple regions, you just need to copy and have multiple providers for the region that you want. Next, we will select the API. And this is the first resource block that we will have. From here on out, as I stated, it will be only resources that we will control. And the resource has the format of, you have the resource, you have the resource type, and you will have a name. The name is just something, that you select. It could be anything. In this case, I'll just put it API, but anything that you can put it can be just a one-letter string. It will be used, again, in the future for linking resources. But in this case, we are starting to develop the API, where we will only give it a simple name. The name will be important a bit afterwards. I will come back to this as well. And then a simple description. The description is optional, but it's always good to have a description to see what we'll be doing. A little bit of sidetrack again. If this was to create a GitHub repo, this is what it would look like. So again, we have the provider, in this case for GitHub, where you have your token and your organization. And then again, we just start to have resources. In this case for GitHub, any resource is just a repo. Continuing on our example, as you can see, the image is appearing again, because in this time, we will start having things for AWS API Gateway. In here, we are taking care of the resource part, so the yellow big block. What does this yellow big block mean? Unfortunately, the name is the same, so it's a resource, but in this case, a resource for AWS API Gateway. The resource, it's for us to configure the endpoint that we are listening. So that's why this path part exists. This path part is the last, or the last segment of your API resource. If you want the full path, you can also have it. So you put the path, but in the pathway, you will need to have the complete API resource. This Proxy Plus is a Terraform handler, special handler, that just says, I'm not interested on what comes after, on what comes. This could be a little bit fine-grained, so you can put something like users / this handler, Proxy Plus, and it will match users/posts and users/notes, for instance. So it's just, I don't care what comes afterwards. I will consume this. Next, and this is how we link stuff. Previously, we see that the resource API would have a resource type and a name. So when we want to link resource blocks on whatever it needs, we have a handler where we put the resource type and then the name. Every resource outputs an ID. It could output some more stuff, but the ID is mandatory. And next, we have the parent ID. What is the parent ID? Parent ID is where we will mount this resource. So these resources can be composable, but in our case, we just want to mount on the top resource. Why? As composable that can be, if you have a resource with, let's say, a path part of users, if you create another resource with the path part active, and you use that on another resource, and then the other resource uses the parent ID for the user's resource, it will say that the second one will listen to users/active. The other one will just listen to users/. So if you do a show and users/, it's the first one that will listen, but if you do a users/active, it's the second resource that will listen. Next, we have the method one. The method one is where we start to drilling down a bit. So in this case, it will be the left blue square. And what the method does, it's a specification of what endpoint are we listening. So the method will define the HTTP method. So in here, it could be anything, any HTTP method that you know. But in our special case, that we want a proxy, we are listening to any endpoint. So then you can also have some authorization. So you can even add authorization to specific endpoints and with specific HTTP methods. This is how you start to, or you can start having the authorization and the authentication outside of your monolith. In our case, we don't want none. We just want none, so pass through, and the authorization will be done at the backend. There is also the request parameters. Yeah. The request parameters are a map of request. It's a query string of parameters and headers, and in here we are just filtering out. I don't know. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Okay. We are just filtering out, or whitelisting, what are the parameters that we will pass through to continue our request. So it could be headers, it could be parameters that come on the path. So imagine if you have an ID that comes on the path that you want to continuing and pass it through, you just put it here. Again, this is all linked to our API. That's how we'll link, again, everything will be linked to our API. So that's why you always have the REST API ID. It will also, it has a double binding, so we also link it to the resource. So it knows what resource are we talking about. As I said, like the resource has the URL, this has the HTTP method. So these two need to be linked as well. Next, we have the integration. So we are now on the right blue block. What integration does, it's how we are going to react to that request that we just got. So mainly, we get a request in, and then we do a request to our backend, wait for the response, and then it has a double response. So our backend in here could be your backend, your monolith, but it could also be Lambda. You can run the Lambda for a specific API request. You can even do nothing. So if you want, you can just like say 200 OK and do nothing with the request that you just got. There's some caveats here. So this HTTP method is the HTTP method from the resource that we just saw, which is the method. That's why you have to link it. But then you also have the integration HTTP method. This is the HTTP method that will run to our request to whatever backend that we have. Then it's what are we going to do with that request? In our case, it's an HTTP proxy. So we are passing the request over, but the integration HTTP method and the type are a bit linked. So if you want to run a Lambda, for instance, on the type we will put AWS proxy, but the integration HTTP method needs to be post. That's something that AWS needs. I don't know why. And then you will have, in our case, because we are doing an HTTP proxy, you will have the URI. URI is where you will call. So it will call, in our case, your domain.com on the same method that he got from the method resource. If we define an integration HTTP method, it will do that request with that HTTP method. There's also a caveat here where you can put some variables on the URI. As you can see, there's a proxy. In this case, it's not a special handler. It's just the name of the variable that you can put on the URI to be used to our advantage. Our advantage be fetching it from the request parameter. So this one is the same that we had on the method one. It's just a query string. But in here, we are linking what we want to pass through on our request. So we are linking on the path the proxy variable from the method resource. So that's why you have this thing. Yeah, I know. It was a bit long, a little bit code heavy. So let's wrap this thing around a bit. So the resource. The resource is where we will configure what we are listening. The method is where we specify how we are listening. We are listening to everything on every HTTP method, but we can configure both of them. And then the integration is how we are going to respond or do another request to our backend. So again, showing the same image, you can see that the method, it's in conjunction with the resource, it's what we are listening, but then it's passed through to the integration to do the request to whichever backend that we have. So cool. We have an API gateway working. All good. The name, there's two caveats here. The name that we chose on the first resource that we saw, the API, will be used as the URL. This, of course, is an URL defaultly generated by AWS. And it has the name of our API gateway and the region where it is. So what would happen if you pass this to a client? Imagine you are a client, you are a supplier, and you say to the client, yeah, please come in, access this URL, and send me some money because I just did some work for you. Probably will say like, an API gateway, a region, it has an execute? Come on. I'm not that dumb. That's a scam, definitely. So, as a final challenge, why not put it a little more friendly, saying like, yeah, this is totally not a scam.com, please access it and send me some money. So, again, some more resources to the rescue. In this case, we will have a domain resource and a base path mapping resource. So, the domain one is like, if you have a domain, you can configure it. So the only mandatory attribute here will be the domain name. In our case, totally not a scam.com. And then you will have to use that domain that you have to configure it. In our case, we have the certificate name, the certificate body, the chain, and the private key. Again, this is not the way that Terraform tells us to do, because again, this will be stored in clear text. So for this certificate stuff, you will have some other options, namely ACM, which is AWS Certificate Manager, and IAM, which is Identity and Access Management, where you can configure this to not to be in clear text. And then what you have is the base path mapping. Base path mapping is just a way to link our domain to our API. So when you hit that domain, you know that the API should respond to it. So you have the API ID, again, linked. And then you have the domain name, which was the one that we just configured. So yeah, now we're talking. Now we have a working API gateway with a custom domain where you can send all of your clients there and collect some money. So thank you all. That's me, Ricardo from Onfido. We are hiring. And this talk was heavily inspired on the blog post that I wrote about the same concept. So that's it. Questions? No.
Cool talk, thanks. What kind of authorization options do you have to use this on API Gateway?
Authorization options?
Yeah.
So you have, again, let me put in the slide just for context. You're saying authorizations to, let me go here. You are saying on when you configure the API? Sorry. Next one. Here. Yeah, you have a custom one, when you can build one. You have AWS AIM, again. And you have a thing called Cognito User Pools. I don't know the difference between all of them, but you have some options where you can use it. Anything else? Anyone? Well, that's it then. Thank you so much.